Chapter 1. Father's Garden. Hello, my name is James Ailing. It's sort of a boring name, but it's mine, and it still feels like home. I was born near London, England, on January 10th, 1833. I only lived there for the first 5 years of my life, yet even now, after more than a century and a half, those few years remain among the clearest memories I possess. It has often seemed strange to me that a life filled with extraordinary events should begin in my memory with such wonderfully ordinary happiness. Father was always a strong, quiet presence in our home. I never knew exactly what he did during the day. As a boy, I simply accepted that he left before sunrise and returned when evening settled across the countryside. It never occurred to me to ask where he went. Children have a remarkable gift for believing the world has always been exactly as they find it. Every evening, though, Father spent time in the garden. Mother said it was his time for reflection, when the worries of the day could be buried beneath freshly turned soil. Father always smiled at that and insisted she had it backward. According to him, the garden wasn't where he escaped the world. It was where he remembered what was worth protecting. Then, with the absolute certainty that only a loving father can possess, he would explain that plants grew better after the moon had touched freshly turned earth, and that the cool night air somehow made them stronger. Chad and I believed every word without question. Some of my happiest memories are of those quiet evenings. I can still see Father kneeling among the rows of vegetables with dirt on his hands, pausing now and then to look up at the moon before returning to his work. Sometimes Chad and I carried buckets of water that always seemed far heavier than we remembered on the walk back. Other evenings, we simply sat on the fence and listened while Father talked about the garden, as though every plant had its own personality. At the time, I thought every father knew such things. There are years of my life that have grown hazy with time. Yet those evenings in Father's garden have never faded. I can still remember the smell of freshly turned earth after a cool English sunset, the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus, and the quiet contentment on Father's face as he worked beneath the moon. Memory has never obeyed reason. It has always held tightly to the smallest moments, perhaps because, in the end, they are the ones we love the most. I often wish memories could be arranged as neatly as dates in a history book. It would be comforting if life's happiest moments came first, and its sorrows politely waited their turn. Unfortunately, memory has never worked that way. Whenever I remember Father's garden, I cannot help remembering the last evening I ever saw him there. Shortly before we were to leave England for America, Father was killed by a wolf. It began like so many other evenings that I had no reason to believe it would be remembered above all the rest. Mother had just finished clearing away the supper dishes, while Chad and I argued over whose turn it was to carry water to the garden. Father only smiled, picked up the 2 wooden buckets himself, and carried them outside before either of us could claim victory. Looking back, I sometimes think he enjoyed watching us argue far more than he enjoyed listening to either of us win. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and summer grass through the open doorway. Beside the garden path lay a small rose bush, its roots wrapped carefully in burlap, waiting beside a fresh hole Father had dug near the fence. It was meant for Mother. I remember that now with painful clarity. Father had found what he called the perfect place for it, where morning sun would touch it first and evening shade would spare it from the worst heat of summer. Mother stepped onto the porch and folded her arms with a smile.
"You'll wear yourself out one of these nights,"
she called. Father laughed softly.
Not tonight.
It was such an ordinary answer that I thought nothing of it for many years. Chad and I followed him into the garden for a little while. He showed us how to loosen the soil around the bean plants without disturbing their roots and reminded us, for what felt like the 100th time, that patience was as important in gardening as hard work. Chad lost interest almost immediately and wandered off chasing fireflies. I stayed a little longer, mostly because I enjoyed listening to Father explain things. As children, we often mistake ordinary moments for ordinary people. Only much later do we realize they were quietly teaching us how to live. Eventually, Mother called us back inside to wash up before bed. Father remained in the garden. I remember looking back once before closing the door. He was standing beneath the moon, one hand resting on the handle of his shovel, the little rose bush still waiting at his feet. That is the last peaceful memory I have of my father. It could not have been more than a few minutes later when everything changed. The evening was so quiet that the sound seemed impossibly loud. Father's shovel struck the stones with a sharp metallic clang. Every head turned toward the garden. For the briefest instant, there was only silence. Then Mother screamed. Chad and I reached the door almost at the same moment. Mother was already running toward the garden, her skirts gathered in one hand as she called Father's name. Beyond her, in the pale moonlight, I saw Father on the ground, and a great wolf standing over him. People have asked me over the years whether I was afraid. The truth is, I do not remember fear coming first. Fear came later. At that moment, I remember only Mother running toward the wolf, and the terrible certainty that if Chad and I did nothing, it would reach her next. We did not speak. We did not plan. We simply moved. I grabbed the first tool my hands found. Chad did the same. They were crude weapons for two little boys facing a wolf. And looking back now, I understand that there should have been no contest at all. The wolf should have made short work of us both. Yet it did not. Somehow, between the two of us, we drove it away from Mother. Then, we drove it down. I remember shouting, though I cannot remember what words came out of my mouth. I remember the weight of the tool in my hands, Chad beside me, and Mother's voice calling for us to stop. By the time we did, the wolf no longer moved. For a moment, no one spoke. Mother reached Father first. She knelt beside him in the moonlit garden, and even at 5 years old, I understood, from the sound she made, that something inside our lives had broken. The little rose bush still lay beside the hole he had dug for it. I do not remember deciding to pick it up. I only remember finding it in my hands later, its roots wrapped in damp burlap, its small branches trembling because my own hands would not stop shaking. Mother told everyone Father had killed the wolf before he died. It was not true, but I understand now why she said it. Two little boys surviving such a thing would have raised questions she was not prepared to answer. Since our passage to America had already been paid for, Mother decided we would continue with the move as planned, and so we left England. We took Father's money, the clothes we could carry, the silver cross he had given me shortly before his death, and the little rose bush he never got to plant. In many ways, I think my childhood ended that night in Father's garden, though I was only 5 years old and far too young to understand why. Children have an extraordinary ability to keep living even when their world has changed forever. We cry. We ask impossible questions. Then somehow, we wake the next morning expecting life to continue. Ours did, just not in the way any of us had imagined. Father had always handled our family's affairs, and to Mother's surprise, he had prepared remarkably well for the future. Shortly before his death, he had invested nearly half of our savings in a shipping company. The rest had been left where Mother could easily reach it. At the time, I thought little of such things. I only knew that Mother never seemed worried about whether we would have enough to eat, even during those difficult weeks. Years later, I came to appreciate how extraordinary that was. A widow with two young sons in 1838 faced hardships that are difficult to imagine today, yet somehow Mother carried us through them with a quiet strength that I would not fully appreciate until I was much older. Our passage to America had already been purchased before Father's death. Mother considered remaining in England, but in the end she decided to honor the plans they had made together. Looking back, I believe she understood something that I did not. The house was still there, the garden was still there, but when Father was gone, home was gone with him. Before we left, Mother returned to the garden one last time. Chad and I followed quietly behind her. The garden looked almost exactly as it always had. The rows of vegetables stood neatly in place. The herbs swayed gently in the evening breeze, and Father's tools rested where the neighbors had carefully gathered them after the attack. Had I not known better, I might have believed Father would walk out at any moment, wipe the dirt from his hands, and smile as though nothing had happened. Mother stopped beside the little hole Father had dug. The rose bush still rested where he had left it. She knelt without saying a word. For a long time, none of us spoke. Finally, I picked up the little rose bush and carried it to her.
Should we plant it?
I asked. She looked at the empty hole for several moments before gently taking the rose from my hands. Then she wrapped its roots once more in the damp burlap.
No,
She whispered.
your father planted enough of himself here already.
At 5 years old, I did not understand what she meant. I think she knew she would never return. We carried Father's silver cross around my neck, and Father's rose in our wagon. They were, in many ways, the last pieces of England we would ever call our own. The voyage across the Atlantic lasted several weeks. I remember very little of it now, beyond the endless sound of the sea, the creaking timbers of the ship, and Chad becoming hopelessly seasick whenever the waves grew rough. Looking back, I suspect Mother had far more important things on her mind than keeping two energetic boys entertained aboard a crowded ship. Yet somehow, she still found ways to make us believe we were sailing toward a new beginning instead of away from the greatest heartbreak of her life. Children are wonderfully resilient. Long before Mother had finished mourning England, Chad and I had begun exploring every corner of the ship, asking endless questions of the sailors and pretending the Atlantic Ocean was our own great adventure. Mother always smiled when she watched us, and only now do I understand how much comfort that simple sight must have brought her. I remember standing at the rail one evening, watching England slowly disappear into the mist behind us. I had no idea I was looking at the last sunset I would ever see over the country of my birth. America was still little more than a name to me. I knew nothing of the little white house that awaited us, the church whose bells would one day become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, or the extraordinary people who would forever change the course of my life. I only knew that Mother smiled whenever she spoke about our future. For a 5-year-old boy, that was reason enough to believe everything was going to be all right. America was still wonderfully new to Chad and me. Every day seemed to bring something different to explore, and before long, we had settled into the comfortable routines that children seem able to create almost anywhere. One of those routines was Sunday. No matter how busy Mother became, Sunday belonged to church. The first time the church bells rang across the countryside, I stopped whatever I was doing and listened. For just a moment, I was back in England. Different church, different country. The bells sounded almost the same. It is a curious thing what the heart chooses to recognize. Long before I felt at home in America, I felt at home hearing church bells. Our church was a simple white country church standing on a gentle rise overlooking the surrounding farms. It wasn't grand or impressive by the standards of the great cathedrals of Europe, but to me, it was beautiful. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto polished wooden pews worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. The air always carried the comforting scent of old wood, candle wax, and well-loved hymn books. The first time I met Father Riley, I noticed his smile before anything else. Some people smile only with their mouths. Father Riley smiled with his entire face. He had kind eyes that seemed to notice everyone who entered the church, especially children. Instead of speaking down to us, he always knelt, so we were nearly eye to eye, as though whatever we had to say was every bit as important as what any grown-up might tell him. Children decide remarkably quickly whether an adult can be trusted. Chad and I trusted Father Riley almost immediately. After Mass, Mother introduced us.
This is James.
She said, resting her hand gently on my shoulder.
And this troublemaker beside him is Chad.
Father Riley laughed, the kind of warm laugh that made you want to laugh with him.
I've known many little boys,
He said,
and I've yet to meet one who wasn't accused of being a troublemaker, at least once.
Chad grinned proudly, as though he had just received a compliment. Father Riley chuckled again, before his eyes settled upon the silver cross hanging around my neck.
That's a remarkable cross.
He said quietly. I instinctively reached up and held it.
My father gave it to me for my 5th birthday.
Something in Father Riley's expression changed, though only for the briefest moment.
And where did your father find such a beautiful piece?
He asked gently.
I don't know.
I admitted.
He said another priest gave it to him when he was younger.
For a second, he simply looked at the cross. Then he smiled again.
Would you mind if I looked at it a little more closely?
I glanced at Mother. She nodded. Carefully, I lifted the chain over my head and placed the cross into Father Riley's hands. He turned it over slowly, studying every detail with a fascination I did not understand. As a 5-year-old boy, I assumed all priests found crosses interesting. Looking back now, I suspect Father Riley was not studying the cross nearly as much as he was studying the little boy wearing it. He returned it with great care and slipped the chain gently back over my head.
Take good care of it.
He said softly.
I have a feeling it will take good care of you.
At the time, I thought he simply meant that it had belonged to my father. Many years later, I realized he may have understood far more than I ever imagined. From that day forward, Father Riley was never simply the priest of our little church. Somehow, without any of us planning it, he became part of our family. Whenever Mother needed to travel into New York City, Father Riley would happily look after Chad and me. He always insisted that the laughter of children belonged in God's house just as surely as hymns and prayers. Looking back now, I think Mother believed she had found someone to watch her boys for a few hours. What she had truly found was another man who would quietly help teach them how to become good men. The years passed more quickly than I realized they would. Before long, Chad and I were no longer the little boys who had crossed the Atlantic clutching Father's cross and Father's rose. We had grown into healthy farm boys, always finding some new adventure among the woods, fields, and streams surrounding our home. Looking back now, those years were wonderfully ordinary. Perhaps that is why I treasure them so dearly. I was 12 years old the summer everything quietly began to change. It started as one of those perfect afternoons that seemed to belong only to childhood. The sky was brilliantly blue, the fields shimmered beneath a warm summer sun, and the little stream beside Father Riley's church sparkled so invitingly that Chad and I wasted no time asking permission to go swimming.
All right.
Father Riley laughed.
But don't wander too far. I'll be calling you back for lunch before long.
We promised we wouldn't. Whether he believed us or not, I cannot honestly say. The wide bend in the stream had become one of our favorite places. The water was cool and clear, seldom deeper than my waist, and shaded by enormous oak trees whose branches stretched out over the water like welcoming arms. We must have spent an hour splashing one another, racing across the shallows, and inventing games that probably made perfect sense only to two young brothers. Eventually, Chad became fascinated with trying to catch minnows. I, on the other hand, decided to climb the old oak tree. That tree had become an old friend by then. I had climbed it so many times that I knew every sturdy branch by heart. From its highest limbs, I could see nearly everything around the church. Farmers working distant fields, wagons making their way along the road, and the stream winding lazily through the countryside until it disappeared around a gentle bend. I remember pausing near the top. For reasons I could never explain, I looked one last time toward that bend in the stream. There are moments that seem completely ordinary while you're living them. Only years later do you realize your entire life quietly changed in the space of a single heartbeat. Around the bend, where the trees opened just enough for sunlight to reach the water, were two girls. The older one looked to be about my age. The younger was closer to Chad's. They were laughing together as they splashed in the shallow water, completely unaware that anyone else was nearby. I had never seen either of them before. The older girl wasn't posing or trying to attract attention. She was simply enjoying a summer afternoon with her little sister. I remember the sound of her laughter carrying softly across the water, before I remember anything about her face. Even now, after all the years that have passed, that laughter is the first thing I remember. At 12 years old, I certainly didn't understand why I couldn't seem to look away. I only knew that, for reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly hoped I might somehow meet her one day. At the time, I thought I was making a very modest wish. Looking back now, I cannot help smiling at how completely that wish was granted. The thought had scarcely crossed my mind when my foot slipped. It was a remarkably efficient shortcut. One step, from the top of the tree, all the way to the ground. Looking back, I suspect my dignity suffered nearly as much as my body. Anna always insisted my pride suffered considerably more. For reasons that still escape me, she found that story funnier every time she told it, even centuries later. According to her, most boys simply introduce themselves. Apparently, I preferred falling out of trees. The landing, however, was considerably less amusing. I remember the violent impact, the sharp crack as my arm struck one of the lower branches on the way down. Then, nothing. Darkness claimed the rest of the afternoon. When I finally opened my eyes again, sunlight had given way to the warm orange glow of evening filtering through the church windows. My head ached. My arm felt strangely heavy. For a few moments, I simply stared at the ceiling, trying to remember why I was lying in Father Riley's small room instead of beside the stream. Then the tree came back to me. the girls, the fall, and to my everlasting embarrassment, the realization that the greatest first impression I had ever made on the girl who would eventually become the love of my life consisted entirely of falling out of a tree before she'd ever even learned my name. When I finally opened my eyes, I found Father Riley sitting beside my bed. His head was bowed. His hands were folded tightly together. At first, I thought he was asleep. Only later did I realize he had spent the afternoon praying. The moment I whispered, "Could I have some water?" he looked up so quickly that I nearly startled him. Relief washed across his face. Not excitement, not surprise, simple, heartfelt relief. Without a word, he hurried to a pitcher, resting on a nearby table, filled a cup, and gently helped me sit up enough to drink. I had never known water could taste so wonderful.
You mustn't move too much.
He said kindly.
You've been badly injured.
I frowned.
What injuries?
He smiled, clearly believing the fall had left me confused.
Your arm was badly broken.
He explained.
The bone broke through the skin. You also struck your head rather hard.
I looked down at my arm. It felt perfectly normal. I flexed my fingers. Nothing hurt.
I feel fine.
Father Riley smiled, relieved simply to hear me speaking so clearly.
I am very glad to hear that,
He said.
but let us have a look, anyway.
He carefully untied the splint that had supported my arm throughout the day. His movements were slow and gentle, expecting to find a wound that would still require great care. The last strip of cloth fell away. He froze. There was no blood, no swelling, no broken bone pressing against the skin, not even a scar. For a long moment, he simply stared. Then, as though convinced he had somehow unwrapped the wrong arm, he looked from one arm to the other before gently taking my hand and turning it over in disbelief. His own hands had begun to tremble. Without saying a word, he reached for the bandage around my head. I watched him with growing confusion. The cloth came away just as easily as before. Again, nothing. The deep wound that had stained the bandages with blood only hours earlier had vanished completely. My skin was whole. There wasn't even a mark to show where the injury had been. Father Riley slowly made the sign of the cross, not because he feared me, because he suddenly found himself standing before something he could not explain. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he drew a slow breath and looked into my eyes.
James,
He said quietly,
I believe the Lord has entrusted you with something very unusual.
I stared back at him.
I don't understand.
I don't expect you to,
He answered gently. He rested one hand on my shoulder.
but I want you to promise me something.
What?
For now, tell no one about this.
I looked at my arm again.
But why?
Because people are often frightened by things they cannot understand.
He said softly.
Some would call it a miracle. Others might fear it. Still others might try to use it for reasons that are anything but kind.
His expression softened.
I would rather none of those things happen to you.
I nodded.
I promise.
A warm smile returned to his face.
Good.
He sat quietly for another moment, studying me with thoughtful eyes. Looking back now, I believe that was the moment Father Riley stopped seeing me as simply another little boy in his parish. Then he spoke again.
James,
Yes.
what do you remember about your father?
The question surprised me. I thought about it for a moment.
He was always a strong, quiet presence in our lives.
I finally said,
I don't remember what he did for a living. He was always away during the day. But every evening,
I continued, smiling despite myself.
he worked in the garden. He used to say the moonlight on freshly turned soil helped the plants grow.
Father Riley listened quietly.
Mother always said it was his peaceful time, the time he used to think.
My fingers drifted to the silver cross, resting against my chest.
He gave me his cross for my 5th birthday.
Another memory quietly surfaced.
I remember him fastening it around my neck himself.
I smiled.
Before he let go, he rested his hand on my shoulder and said,
Take good care of this cross, James. It will take good care of you.
at the time, I thought he simply meant not to lose it.
Looking back now, I realize he was trying to tell me far more than a 5-year-old boy could possibly understand. Father Riley remained silent for several moments. His eyes rested on the cross. Then they slowly returned to me.
Do you know anything else about him?
He asked softly. I slowly shook my head.
No.
He leaned back in his chair, saying nothing for several moments. The room had grown completely quiet. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the leaves of the great oak tree beyond the church window. Looking back now, I think Father Riley had already begun asking questions that neither of us yet knew how to answer. At the time, I simply wondered why he seemed so interested in my father. Father Riley kept his promise. He told no one. When Mother arrived later that evening, he simply explained that I had fallen from the oak tree, suffered a broken arm and a cut to my head, and that by God's grace, I had awakened feeling much better than anyone had expected. Mother thanked him repeatedly for caring for me. She never questioned why the bandages covered wounds that no longer existed. Perhaps she simply believed that God had answered Father Riley's prayers. Perhaps that was explanation enough. Chad, however, remained unusually quiet during the ride home. Long after we had left the little church behind, he finally spoke.
I'm sorry.
I looked over at him.
For what?
I should have caught you.
For a moment, I simply stared at my little brother. Then I laughed.
You're only 10. You still should have caught me.
Looking back now, that may have been the first of 1,000 times Chad apologized for something that was never his fault. I never blamed him. Neither did Anna, after she learned the story years later. If anything, I suspect she secretly enjoyed having one more reason to tease me about falling out of that tree. By the time we reached home, the summer sun had disappeared beyond the hills, leaving the sky painted with deep shades of orange and purple. The little rose Father had given Mother stood beside the front walk, its leaves moving gently in the evening breeze. Mother paused beside it for a moment before going inside. At the time, I thought she was simply admiring it. Only many years later did I understand she was remembering the man who had chosen it for her. As for me, I was thinking about a girl whose laughter still echoed somewhere in my memory. I did not know her name. I had never spoken a single word to her. I had no way of knowing that one brief glance from the top of an old oak tree would become the beginning of the greatest love of my life. Nor did I understand why my body had healed in a way no ordinary boy's could. I believed those were the great mysteries of that remarkable day. Looking back now, I know I was wrong. The greatest mystery had been resting quietly against my heart since my 5th birthday. I simply wasn't old enough to ask the right questions. Those answers would have to wait. Chapter 2. You're James. Father Riley remained seated for a long while after I had answered his questions about my father. Neither of us spoke. The little room had grown quiet as evening settled over the countryside. The last traces of daylight faded beyond the church windows, and a cool breeze stirred the branches of the great oak outside. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the gathering darkness. Father Riley rose slowly from his chair. For several moments, he simply stood, with his hands folded behind his back, as though searching for the right words. Then he walked to the window and quietly pulled the wooden shutters closed. Not because he feared someone might overhear, but because what he was about to say deserved the privacy of the quiet room. When he returned, he sat beside me once more. He studied me for a long moment before speaking.
James,
His voice was softer than I had ever heard it.
has anyone ever told you stories about vampires?
I stared at him.
You mean the stories about monsters that drink blood?
He nodded.
Those stories.
I couldn't help laughing.
You aren't serious?
Father Riley didn't smile. My laughter slowly faded. For the first time since I had known him, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Not fear. Sorrow. He drew a slow breath.
James, before I tell you something that may be difficult to hear, I want you to answer a few questions.